Capitalism has existed in all times and in all places, but it exists as a parasitic development and as an anomaly. It's the result of sickness, and it's seen that way. And some of you know Valentin Katasonov is one of my favorite Russian-speaking economists these days. He's kind of the Russian version of Paul Craig Roberts. And he lists 10 specific marks of a dying society. When a society is going out of existence, when it simply no longer has the immune system to fight its enemies, what does it start to look like? Now, it's true, we have to use language from our own experience, but it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see how this develops and how this changes over time and place. The first thing is that there's a transformation of the pursuit of wealth from something positively good, not a necessary evil. That money and wealth is a good in and of itself. Second, that this wealth accumulation doesn't have any purpose. It's some very vague sense of pleasure or emulation or keeping up or, some vulgar reason. It has no social purpose. Third, that because this kind of mentality is accepted, it radically alters society. It inverts the natural order. The spirit serves the material rather than the other way around. The fourth is what he calls mutations. Kind of the default mechanism, the default processes mentally of the society are radically altered. Relationships that at one time were cooperative, and generally speaking, nations and economies have, historically been mostly cooperative rather than competitive institutions, that these are replaced by competition and greed. It's a symptom of the society falling apart. The fifth is a radically stratified class society, because those who have already gained money and the power that goes along with it are in the best position to keep it and to gain more. It's irrational, and it leads to the rule of an oligarchy. The sixth mark is oligarchs to maintain themselves, manipulate the desire of the lower classes to justify their own enrichment. So they talk about how they believe in that everyone should pursue their self-interest as they see fit, that somehow this is universal, and therefore the oligarchs just have pursued their own self-interest just more successfully than you have. They see themselves as equal, and that we're all free to do this. But of course the reality is that only their self-interest matters. If I get upset, no one cares. If Warren Buffett gets upset, everyone cares. Essentially, everyone's self-interest is as good as another one. It's this vague universal. And they're able to manipulate the desires of the plebeians for the sake of other proletarians, really. They manipulate the desires so as to make this acceptable. In America, it's often very sexual. They provoke that desire and create things like pornography and for a fee to make it okay, to make it acceptable. When you do that, you remove any kind of intellectual foundation against oligarchy. The seventh mark is that these class relations eventually harden and freeze. It becomes what we would call feudal. It's based on rents, not profits. So then those who are the lower classes really have no incentive to work because they see no purpose. Ninth, usury and what we would call today asset stripping become the main means of making money. And this is because no one has faith in the future of the system, and so no one is going to invest long term. It's not seen as stable. Everything is short term. So if that's the case, then usury and asset stripping, which are, they have the same foundation. Usury means a heck of a lot more than just charging interest on loans. It's essentially the charging of a rent. And finally, it all revolves around the worship of money. the universal mercury, the universal solvent. Hermes, Mercury, is a symbol of commerce as well as deception and destruction. Those are the 10 marks that cut us off. And again, we're using modern terminology, but our job as historians is to go back and see how it applies elsewhere. But it's the same thing. The pursuit of self-interest, the creation of oligarchy, the destruction of communal identity. Because if you have a society based around competition, then you can't have a communal identity. The solvent eventually brings everybody into isolated, egotistical cells. And the fraud, the scam here, is that it sounds like you're supporting this universal notion of freedom. We should do as we please, so long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. But of course, it's laughable, because that really only applies to a handful of people. The self-interest of some average guy is absolutely meaningless. No one cares. No one notices. It's a universal justification for what already exists: class rule. So understand that this is essentially capitalism, self-interest, the rule of money. It's always seen as a perversion. There's nothing normal about it. In fact, it's what happens when natural and normal forms of life are broken down. Up until recently, it was almost universally understood as a precursor to total collapse. Traditional societies, economic life was concentrated in the commune, the extended family. These were all cooperative institutions. But materialism ends up being something like, the rule of the elites in concentrated urban populations over a countryside that's more scattered and very hard to organize. The world trade in goods and local demand create a universal web of dependence. Capitalism is synonymous with this kind of decay. Capitalism is what happens when communal institutions begin falling apart. Without a strong monarchy, oligarchs take over. This is an iron law of civilized history. Those are the only two options. Monarchy, the common good, unity, focus, on the one hand, or decay, once the king has been killed, where self-interest rules, and therefore a small group of oligarchs will rule. It's no accident that the essential message of the Old Testament prophets is that the rejection of Yahweh, which just means I am, and the acceptance of monetary civilization are one and the same thing. Oligarchy reduces men to primal, wild instinct. Though through this kind of ideological manipulation, it's the alchemical ritual where orthodoxy slowly turned to heresy, because all heresy ultimately is social. The Old Testament makes that clear over and over again. Changes in doctrine usually are done ignorantly. It's done because